To understand what nuclear war means, let's take a look at the power of nuclear weapons and their stockpiles in different countries. There are two different types of genres of nuclear weapons. Strategic nuclear weapons are the big ones that are pointed at certain targets and are launched on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine and cruise missiles. Tactical nuclear weapons are non-strategic and are used in smaller, more mobile applications. They work based on the fission of uranium or plutonium nuclei and are generally smaller in explosive power. These types of weapons include gravity bombs, short-range missiles, artillery shells, depth charges, landmines, and some small torpedoes. At the same time, the fusion of deuterium and tritium releases 10 times more energy. So thermonuclear bombs are much more powerful than uranium or plutonium bombs. What's even more frightening is that there's no theoretical limit to the size and yield of a thermonuclear weapon. So what amounts of such a deadly weapon does humanity have at the moment? More than enough. The nuclear club is a term used for the group of nations who possess thermonuclear weapons, and the leaders of this club are Russia and the United States. About 90% of all nuclear warheads are owned by these two countries. Russia has 5,977 nuclear warheads, and the US owns a total of 5,428 warheads in its military stockpiles. You can see the distribution of deadly weapons among other countries on the screen. For humanity, the situation doesn't look good. So how can a nuclear war begin, and how will it happen? Computer simulations show that if Russia detonates even 300 of its strategic warheads over the US metropolitan areas, there'll be about 78 million fatalities in the first half hour. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of the country will be destroyed. The electricity grid, the internet, the food distribution system, the transport network, and the healthcare system. Everything necessary to sustain normal life will disappear. And within a few months after the attack, the vast majority of the US population will fall victim to starvation, radiation sickness, and epidemic diseases. The US attack on Russia has similar consequences, and if NATO is involved, the same fate would await most of Canada and Europe. Let's take a look in more detail at the consequences of a strike on New York, with just one Russian thermonuclear warhead that has a yield of 800 kilotons. Remember, the Russian Satan has 10 of them. Let's say the epicenter of the explosion was in Manhattan, in the center of Times Square. During the first second, a fireball with a radius of 1.15 kilometers will cover an area of 4.15 kilometers squared. Everything inside the fireball will instantly evaporate. And by looking at this photo taken in Hiroshima, you can see what would happen to people. This isn't a drawing. It's a photo of all that's left of an old man with a cane. The nuclear blast from the Hiroshima bomb was so powerful that objects and people in its path left behind black shadows. The intense heat and light bleached the concrete around the shadow, but people who would find themselves in this fiery circle would be still lucky. They would perish without feeling any pain. It would happen faster than electrical signals travel through the nerves to the brain. Following the light wave, there'll be a supersonic shock wave. Within a radius of 2.02 kilometers or an area of 12.8 kilometers squared, the overpressure will be 20 pounds per square inch. Under such pressure, heavy concrete buildings are seriously damaged or destroyed, and the mortality rate is nearly 100%. In a radius of 4.71 kilometers or an area of 69.6 kilometers squared, the overpressure will be 5 pounds per square inch. This pressure is enough to collapse most buildings. The height of the layer of debris will reach 10 meters, burying tens of thousands of unfortunate people under it. So passing away immediately will be huge luck. There'll be fires in many places too. Then people within a radius of 9.7 kilometers or an area of 296 kilometers squared will receive burns of the third degree from thermal radiation. In a radius of 10.9 kilometers, an area of 375 kilometers squared, damage to the lungs from overpressure will occur. And let's not forget about the invisible and silent killer, radiation. Within a radius of 2.43 kilometers, an area of 18.6 square kilometers, the dose of ionizing radiation will be at least 500 rem. Such a dose is fatal within 1 month in 50% of people, and 15% of survivors will eventually pass away from cancer. The total estimated number of fatalities in New York will be almost 1.8 million people, and the number of those with burns, injured, and heavily irradiated would reach over 2.8 million people. However, Satan may not have 10 warheads of 800 kilotons each, but one super thermonuclear warhead with a capacity of 25 megatons. If this thing explodes over New York, almost 5 million people will be gone. The fireball will have a diameter of almost 10 kilometers. This will also create a zone of continuous destruction with a pressure of more than 5 pounds per square inch and a diameter of 27 kilometers. The diameter of the thermal lesion, burns of the 3rd degree and above, would be 82 kilometers. But again, this is what would happen in case of a single strike. If the Russians decide to launch all their nuclear missiles, then the United States will cease to exist, and the same would happen to Russia. But what about the other regions that wouldn't be affected by a direct nuclear attack? Would life be possible there? First, background radiation will significantly increase due to the explosions of thousands of thermonuclear warheads. Nuclear power plants will make a big contribution too. After all, about 440 nuclear power reactors are currently operating on the planet, and this is thousands of tons of highly enriched uranium. The explosion of just one such reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine made an area of 2,600 square kilometers uninhabitable. And now multiply this figure by 440. This is about 1,150,000 kilometers squared. And these infected zones won't be located in any remote places, but near large cities. But then, a war involving the entire US and Russian arsenals could release up to 150 teragrams or 150 million metric tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, bringing global average temperatures down to -8 degrees Celsius. In North America and Eurasia, temperatures will drop by 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. The levels not seen since the last ice age. And this will lead to a catastrophic reduction in food production and starvation that could wipe out most of humanity. In addition, there'll be no electricity. All power plants will be destroyed. No gasoline and no diesel fuel. Oil refineries will be ruined. And if Russians hit the Yellowstone supervolcano with some kind of large thermonuclear bomb, it would provoke its eruption. This alone, without other nuclear strikes, can become a disaster for the United States, because it would suffer most from such an impact. On the spot where once was the national park, there would be a huge hole, and extreme volumes of ash would fall on North America. Volcanologist Robin George Andrews believes that this would lead to problems with agriculture. The ash would clog engines, disable power lines, and pollute the water supply. According to his colleague, professor at the University of Cambridge, Clive Oppenheimer, the atmosphere would be filled with such thick ash that a volcanic winter could begin. If this happens, sulfur dioxide will block the sunlight, the continent will freeze and plunge into darkness, and this is not to mention Russian Poseidon nuclear torpedoes. In case of a nuclear war, these will be sent to the west and east coasts of the United States, and, when exploded, form a tsunami that would hit the country's coastal infrastructure. Also, some nuclear strikes would be aimed at industrial, scientific, and administrative centers. Almost the entire industrial and scientific potential would be destroyed. In other words, survivors would find themselves in the Middle Ages. And even people lucky enough to survive would be plagued by diseases caused by high radiation background levels. As a result, barely any healthy offspring will be born. So, people who expect to survive a nuclear apocalypse on some tropical islands or in Siberia are deluded. Their life will turn into a struggle for survival. So within 1, at most 2 generations or 50 years, humanity would either disappear completely or at least the world population would significantly decrease in number. Whatever the case, this would mean the end of modern civilization.